Mary redeemed a $50,000 cash prize playing Chumba Casino this year.
I was only playing for fun, so winning this was a dream come true.
Chumba Casino is America's #1 social casino experience. It's serious fun. With over 80 casino-style games to choose from, you too could win life-changing amounts of cash. Be like Mary. Log on to ChumbaCasino.com and give them a whirl. That's ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details. The voice in the preceding commercial was not the actual voice of a winner.
Hello, and welcome to the Proactive Caregiving Podcast. As a CPA with over 20 years as an industry accountant, Jessica stepped away from the corporate world to become a full-time caregiver for her mother. Having learned invaluable lessons along the way, she is now here to share those with you and to invite you to join her on this caregiver's journey. Here is your host, Jessica Cannon.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad you're here with me today. I am the Proactive Caregiver, and I specialize in educating others on how to be proactive by empowering you, the caregiver. If you cannot take care of yourself, then you can't take care of your loved one. Today, I want to talk to you about caregiver environment with investor and Nest strategist, Christopher Hahn. The reason behind this is because many years ago, Mom tried to make me promise that I would never place her in a nursing home just because of her understanding of what state-run nursing homes represented to her. My response then was, I can only promise to keep her home for as long as possible. I knew the time would come that her needs would surpass my level of care and boundaries. I also knew that someday our 2-story house would become a safety hazard for Mom to navigate both day and night. So I started to do research 2 years before the time came to make that official transition for her. As I looked in different communities, I started to see something I did not appreciate. Seniors are commoditized like healthy, conscious individuals searching a neighborhood gym. On most tours, I was presented with the bells and whistles, followed by a hefty price, which only reinforced my gut that assisted living industry that just doesn't truly understand what dementia is. Training of the staff caregivers might have varied from place to place, which might have helped slow their turnover, but the environment was crucial to me. Christopher Hahn understands this all too well. He understands the needs for seniors to have an environment that supports their current living, which goes above and beyond safety. As an investor across various interests, fate led him to a passion-based investment in Texas and becoming an owner-operated memory care platform. His passion paved the way to the founding principle behind the award-winning Stony Brook Communities in Central Texas. With over 19 years of experience in senior care space, Christopher has become an established developer known for high quality and successful projects in the Midwest and Texas. Christopher has become a very much so recognized expert with the HUD 232 lien protocol for new construction financing. He has 100% approval rate over more than a dozen projects across 3 portfolios. But before senior care, Christopher Hahn spent 14 years as a specialist in structured derivatives in New York after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania with a bachelor's in economics and a minor in art history. During his tenure on Wall Street, he specialized in derivative structures and risk management. He also taught derivative theory at NYU and Seton Hall to over 30 domestic corporations, regional banks, and even central banks in Brazil, Mexico, Singapore, and Indonesia. Christopher is not all business, though, because in his spare time, he's able to go skiing, cycling, tennis when the shoulder allows for it, and he enjoys true New York style pizza. So thanks for coming on with me today, Chris.
Hi, guys. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The conversation that we had about a week ago just had that beacon of light that not only told me how much I was learning at that moment, but how much others could learn from you. Because I felt like when I stepped into this, there was issues, there were problems that needed to be addressed. But me as the consumer, I had limited knowledge to go on that.
Sure.
So before we get into a lot of the nitty-gritty details, I think it would be awesome for our listeners to understand how someone like yourself went from Wall Street to senior living facilities and transitioning into the senior living care communities.
Sure, Jessica, I think that's an easy story. Like a lot of people, I got into it by accident. And I got into it by accident through a man I met in New York City who lived in the Midwest. Fascinating individual, very intelligent, very smart. And he invited me out to Iowa, where, long story short, we ended up building a portfolio of assisted living and what we called at that time secondary markets in rural counties. And that gave an acute understanding of what drove the industry, what drives the ethics, and what drives the choices that families make when they put a parent or a loved one into a senior care community. And from that, I kind of realized that it was a perfect intersection, a perfect place for me. It was the combination of old people, which in my culture and in my ethic are venerated and held in high esteem, and design, which I had originally intended when I went to college, architecture, and business. So it was the confluence of those three things, and it really made me feel at home in the space. And when you first get started, of course, you're learning the industry and whatnot. It's only after several years that you begin to see the seams in the industry and the soft underbelly of it. And if you're really a true believer, you can't help but try to improve that experience for everybody who comes along. And that's kind of what drove me into my current platform, which is a boutique memory care platform. I call it a community model and design that I think works better for both families and residents in the memory care space.
And that space is something that, like you said, it took me a couple of years of just barely, and I was coming from it from a different perspective. So in those couple of years that I was trying to get that better understanding, from what I was seeing was far different from what you were saying.
I think it would help for your listeners just to take a step back, if we can, and briefly kind of differentiate what they mean by senior care.
Yes.
I think most people understand that independent living is a service-free congregate living style, which is basically a multifamily apartment setup where the services provided are minimal. And of course, that's for people who remain active and whatnot. The second step on that spectrum is assisted living. And for lack of a better word, assisted living is intended for frail elderly, those who need assistance with what we call activities of daily living, ADLs. And that may range from dressing, companionship, showering, feeding, but they're essentially intact in terms of their mental facilities and whatnot, and just need assistance getting through the day. Keeping in mind that the primary benefit of assisted living is primarily a social benefit and interaction with fellow residents. Memory care is a wholly different beast. It is a highly supportive and intense environment that caters to those with dementia-related symptoms. And by definition, it almost requires a high degree of observation and a high degree of engagement. And that's kind of exactly what many residents in the industry do not get. And I think that's mainly due to how the industry is structured. If you take that point and step back from it, given the demographic, senior care has become a hot investment asset and a hot investment class for institutional buyers, we call them. By institutional buyers, I mean large pension funds, insurance companies,
Right.
large institutions that need stable long-term income. And of course, you have large senior care companies who tend to seek dividend growth, and they do that through some development, but primarily through acquisitions. The issue comes in when you consider that asset classes naturally attract money, and most of that money comes in the form of short-term investors teaming up with even shorter-term developers. Both tend to seek exits at some point in time. Both tend to seek faster exits than not, and large payoffs. That's what we call a merchant build model. And that's where the goal is to build, fill, and sell. And that really encapsulates what the merchant build model is about. What that means is that short-term interests are prevalent in the industry. And that results in that commoditized approach to seniors that you spoke of, and that we've talked about. In that kind of commoditized approach, it explains why there's third-party managers, changes in management, changes in ownership. And this filters down to an interactive level with people. When they go in, they'll meet a marketing director, a person who has nothing to do or has no impact on the care of your family member. They're selling you a product that chances are they won't be around in 2 years later. And the reason why is that they're looking to get these bonuses that are attached to lease up, what we call lease up residency, where you're building occupancy for the owner / developer in the hopes of maximizing short-term income to drive a sale. And what that means is that the interests of your developer owners and operators are divergent from really why you're there in the first place, which is the care of your relative.
Exactly.
And so you've got a lot of people who are hyper-focused on margin, hyper-focused on occupancy. And there's been for lack of a better word, what I call a Disneyfication in senior care, where a lot of product coming to market is over-featured. I consider that over-featuring to be the backbone of these slick marketing campaigns that are predicated mostly on a real estate platform, where they're trying to sell you on the amenities, all of which are costly, all of which require, fantastic maintenance, and none of which really has an impact on the care of the resident. So you're seeing kind of the market striate into two levels, for lack of a better word. You have the high end that pitches these real estate driven, fancy, glossy sales, and everyone else. And so in these larger facilities, you tend to get memory care services provided as an appendage to the main identity of the community, which is either an assisted living or continuous care community. And it's frequently buttonholed into the floor plan as a higher margin wing. And so that allows sales offices to leverage that kind of facade and the high-end features that have zero impact in the memory care environment, but that you will end up paying for. Exactly. And all of that revolves around the need to drive revenue, to drive income, to drive margin, to be sold at maximum value. None of that inures to the benefit of the residents or their families, who are paying for more and I think getting less service.
Absolutely.
And what ends up happening in those environments all too often is over medication. It is a problem that we see. We get a lot of what we call transitional residents, those who have moved out from other places, and their medication load is substantially more than what our doctor recommends. And I think part of that is situational. And what I mean by that is you get a large population of memory care residents. You have a larger range of behaviors. You've got larger potential for conflict. And with larger populations and distractions, you have longer transitions and a higher base level of agitation.
Right.
I think the way you address this is, number one, to avoid the trap that a fancy dining room with a fancy sounding dining program, with a fancy sounding memory care program. I think a lot of these communities walk up to the line of what's really fair to be marketed. There's a general impression that these programs will walk back dementia when there is no evidence to suggest that, no medical evidence, no anecdotal evidence. It's a part of the glossy sales pitch that you will get. At the community that I have been working on, we don't have a program because we consider interaction and engagement to be a 24-hour process, just like at home. You don't give your parents 6 hours of time a week or 20 hours of time a week.
Right.
You give them attention as needed, and that's what we do. So I think the way you tackle this is several ways. In a memory care environment, smaller is better.
Yes.
Limits the population, which limits the behavioral spectrum. But most importantly, it emphasizes a familiarity of other, familiarity of staff, and familiarity of surrounding to a much higher and more consistent degree. That paves the way for easier, smoother transitions.
Yes.
In smaller environments, residents can't get lost or overlooked. And what that means is they can't be neglected.
Exactly.
In a smaller setting, you have more natural and frequent interactions between staff and residents, just due to the flow and how people centrally collect in a smaller environment, which means that you can be more observational and proactive in your care approach. When you revise your care approach to be proactive instead of reactive, you can monitor residents more easily. You can track changes in their conditions, which is hard to do in large populations, higher staff numbers, more distraction. It's very hard to establish a baseline of what each resident's condition is. When you can observe this, and I just ask your listeners to consider that most of them will probably know something's wrong with a parent within the first 10 seconds of either seeing them or hearing them on the phone. And they do that by appearance, tone of voice, color of skin, expression.
Yes.
And those are things that get lost in larger groups and larger communities.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that.
All of those things comprise a rhythm, and every resident has a different rhythm. And to shoehorn a set program fails to account for each person's rhythms. We can do that on a smaller scale because accounting for people's rhythms are part of the natural order that we keep track of in a smaller environment. That reduces everybody's anxiety, their stress, and what that means is it reduces over medication.
Yes.
So by offering these smaller buildings, and I'll be honest, we defeature them, I call it. We get rid of the high cost vanity features. We do that intentionally to generate savings that we pass directly one for one to families. So we don't have high cost overhead, and we don't have a high management overhead. When you're in a small environment, a small footprint, I call it, it really does require active owners who participate in the everyday over your obvious managers in the community, over the staff. When you have active owners, you have, number one, you don't have middle management. Number two, you have a generally higher sense of accountability from staff and managers and owners to residents and their families. You have more operating consistency. And to be honest, you have more flexibility. The buck stops with me. If somebody needs something, I can make that decision right there, right then, without having to worry about a corporate framework to negotiate, back and forth. I can look people in the eye when they ask and tell them yes or no in response immediately. And all this, we think, comprises a much better value proposition for residents and their families, and that's what we've been told. So I've been very pleased to validate the smaller is better platform in a memory care setting. We're excited about it. We think it has a lot to offer our residents and their families, and we are on the low end of market rates, if not the lower cost provider in the market. And we can do that because of a combination of all these factors.
And it's fabulous. And I understand this now because as the average consumer, I want to say that I fall into this average consumer space, that when I was originally looking for mom, the difference in communities that I went from the mini mansion style to a little bit smaller but still high occupancy to the smaller still what on my end of this I would call the group home, but seeing the difference and trying to find something that I thought was, oh, mom would definitely like this because of the features, because that's what caught my eye walking into each of these places, seeing the features. But I fell prey to that same mentality that somehow the look and feel of stepping into a facility, that the features were going to offer her better care, which was not true by any means. And changing her from one community to this smaller group community, just as you explained, I actually saw the difference in her complexion, the difference in her medication, the transfer that took place, and acknowledging the list of medications she started with there, which transferred with her, were far more than I had acknowledged, and given the new place information that these are her listed doctor approved medications, she was on far more than I was aware of. So
that's not surprising. Here's something for anybody to consider. In these large and let's just call them fancy high price communities, they are plagued by the same issues that any and all other communities are plagued by: staff turnover, low cost wages, overworked staff, poor food, a lack of accountability. All of those things affect those big communities just as well. Just because your dining room has stone in it doesn't mean that they don't have better staff. It doesn't mean that somebody won't get lost or anything.
Yes.
And you're right, those features are intended to hit you. They're intended to attract you, and they're intended to convey a sense of gravitas that doesn't really show up operationally. So what I tell people is, number one, in a memory care environment, you should probably look for about four things. And it just comes down to these four things. It's very simple. Find out who owns the place, who they are, what they're about, because chances are that ownership is going to change.
Yes.
2, find a dedicated environment. Memory care and assisted living are different. People package the two together because there's this notion that as people age, and I shouldn't say it's a notion, people will eventually get Alzheimer's and dementia-related symptoms. Having that ability to transfer is nice, but it really is designed to benefit the investor, owner, operator.
Right.
And the reason why is that those are higher yielding beds that increase the margin of these large communities. So if you're going to build 80 beds, why not make 15 of them memory care, because you get a higher yield per square foot. I think that's an atrocious way to approach memory care. You really want a dedicated space that memory residents can call their own, become familiar with, that's not shoehorned into a bigger floor plan. meant to boost revenue. 3, the sales pitch, the high, glossy, fancy sounding names mean nothing in a memory care environment. What's critical in a memory care environment is that observationally based care, engagement, interaction, and support when they need. A high, glossy, high-pitched sales pitch doesn't ensure that at all. It only ensures that you're paying for that high, glossy sales pitch.
Exactly.
And chances are the person you're speaking to will not be there in 2 years as they seek and chase bonuses filling up a new community. That happens more than people realize. In fact, some of the communities around us in the last 5 years, they've had 5 directors, 3 marketing directors, and that's normal and par for the course. Where we are, I'm working with people that I've worked with for 12 years now. You will see me there. You will see them there. You will see us there tomorrow. You will see us there next week. You saw us 4 years ago. You will see us 4 years from now. And what that communicates to a family and their resident is that if you have a problem, you can call me, you can call us, and we will figure out that problem today, right?
Exactly.
There is no one else that we need to please. There is no other corporate hurdle or process to go through. We can do that subjectively, objectively. We can do it immediately. The other thing to check wherever people go to visit is find out who the longest serving staff member is, and find out if those managers have the authority to decide on the scene, on the spot. That is critical because it speaks to the operational integrity and emphasis and focus of what the operational team is trying to accomplish. Managers who have the authority to decide on spot will be aligned with the resident's best interest. If they can't decide on the spot, they are aligned with the corporate interest. It's binary, period. It's simple and clear. And the last thing I would tell people is to, like you did, and I'm so impressed, I have to say, meeting you and discovering how much you had deep dived into this industry and all of its options. I was very impressed by that, is for your other listeners to do the same. To the extent that they can, become familiar with what memory care is, when it's needed, and what to look for. And I think there are a few communities around that are like mine that do a good job. And I would seek those communities out and not fall for the bells and whistles.
Yes, and this is why I really wanted to have you on to help share this information for the listeners, because again, on my side of the fence here as a consumer, I've spoken to other caregivers before I actually stepped out on the streets and drove to the communities to get my own impression stepping into places. I asked, what are good places in the area? Where have you gone? What has your family member experienced? And there were other caregivers that actually would tell me, oh, there's this place up the road. It's been there for who knows how long, decades. It once was called this, and then it became that, and then it just recently became, so it clued me in right away. That one has been changed. The ownership has changed hands so many times. And
that is correct.
Even in the very first community, what I call my training wheels experience for mom, getting her into the first community, she wasn't even there a full year and management changed because I didn't know to ask early on who owns it, how long they owned it, because the beautiful glossy folder that I received with all of their amenities and all of their pricing and all of their floor plans, it was nice to hold, but it told me nothing about the kind of care my mom would get. And I just saw large sticker prices. And to me, it was alarm bells going off, because if something is starting at such a high rate, and they made it clear to me, not the level of care, but their perceived activities list and what their cost of living, just letting me know up front, our cost of living is anywhere from 3 to 5%. Well, after COVID, it was 6%. But they let me know right away, this is what you can expect in terms of cost and what they were providing me for that cost. But it still, the conversation never really focused on care. It was about the
That's right.
amenities they were trying to provide her.
So a couple things that what you just said reminds me of. One is we haven't had, unfortunately, we had to bump our prices or are going to be bumping our prices going into next year. We have not had a price increase in 4 years.
That's
and
impressive.
we had to, because number one, the wages needed to rise for our staff.
Mm-hmm.
And we did spend up more. We did end up spending more in the last 2 years just due to PPE
Mm-hmm.
and sanitation
Right.
and having to reapproach certain line items in our budget in light of COVID. But we held out as long as we could. And even so, our price increases are less than anybody else's. In fact, they're kind of token. And we made a conscious decision that we would try to hold our pricing as low as possible, not as high as possible, to assist families meet this burden. We understand it's a burden, and we were willing implicitly to cost share. Two, these glossies that are full of floor plans, features, I'm sure they had an insert about their fantastic dining program,
Mm-hmm.
all these things and their activities. None of that actually happens in the way that you expect it's going to happen.
Exactly.
What we do is we let our residents and their families tell us what activities their parents liked. And we pitch throughout the day to all of those activities. Somebody at some point in time gets something that's on their top 5 favorite list. In other words, we pitch our activity program to the resident, as opposed to having residents buy in to our 20-hour-a-week program. We engage our residents as a matter of walking through the building, as a matter of lunch, as a matter of just hanging out in our main commons. We try to engage our residents at all times that they want to be engaged in the way that they want to be engaged. Not everybody likes to be engaged, in which case these fancy programs are meaningless to you. So we don't bother with that. We try to cultivate our relationship with the person. And you can only do that on a small footprint. You can't do that with a large population with varied behavioral aspects and varied interests. It becomes something that you cannot do as a matter of practice. The last thing I'll say is, through these kind of interactions and small space bonhomie, if you want to call it, our residents have gotten used to our staff. Our staff participates in our residents. Everybody kind of has an awareness of each other. And what that does is it reduces the base level of stress for everybody. Mm-hmm. So our environment isn't only good, I think, for residents and their families, but it's also good for our staff.
Yes.
So when you have your staff and they're working in what I call the de-stressed environment, your chances of reducing staff turnover are higher. Mm-hmm. If you can couple that with next level certification paid for by the company, bonuses when we can, and you share with your staff the meaning of what memory care is, the benefits of memory care, and if we outperform our numbers, sharing back with resident families and staff, it's a win-win for everybody.
Yes.
And how we do that with our residents, with our residents' families, is we often just pick up things that they don't even know about. That we pick up certain supplies for residents, and we have the flexibility to make allowances on meals. You should be aware of that. And we sponsor at any time. Families are more than welcome to come over and have lunch with us or meet the owners and like you and I, establish a relationship that's beyond the immediate care dynamic. We enjoy that. we encourage that. We look at it as a family approach that I think is important for us as well as families. So that environment has benefits for our staff as well. It's why we've avoided most of the staff turnover and burnout that other places have been hit with. We don't nearly have the same level of stress and workload in the sense of overloading our staff. And I think it all fits together with our philosophy, and that is simply to care for these people as if they were our family on a simple, straightforward basis. We don't have levels of care. We have a fixed fee that's all inclusive, and it doesn't really go up. It hasn't really go up. It's going to go up, unfortunately. Yeah. But for the last 4 years, it hasn't. I think we're the only one in the industry that hasn't raised prices in those 4 years.
It's incredible.
Yeah. And all of this is possible because of our approach and our philosophical center of how we look at memory care. We don't look at it as a disease to be managed and commoditized. We look at it as people who are suffering. Yes. And we're there to help support them and give them a safe environment and a cared for environment, reducing as much stress as possible. And that in turn translates to an assurance that we give to the families of our residents that at least we are endeavoring along these lines. We may not always get it right, but we will endeavor along these lines better than anybody else. And that I can assure you of.
I absolutely agree. And I totally appreciate it because I've experienced it. I've seen that firsthand. I've seen the changes and improvement, which you said it earlier. Mom is not going to be any less of a person living with dementia as time goes. She's in a place now that she is loved. There is an absolute family atmosphere. And one of the things that I absolutely appreciate, and I want other listeners to understand, is that the industry, just because you approach certain assisted living or memory care facilities, you cannot make the assumption that they understand what dementia is. And so this individualized approach that your communities have, it's refreshing to me because Mom, her form of dementia is not dominant with Alzheimer's. So their list of activities and things that they're trying to offer me as something that would sound appeasing for me to place Mom there are things that don't fit her form of dementia. It's not a one size fit all. So when you have the environment that is more of that individualized, just like education, if you think of classrooms, the smaller the classroom, the better the child learns because they have that individual attention. So Mom has created so much, her personality, of course, yes, she still has dementia. So the challenges are still present. The aggression that I've talked about before, that is all driven by the deterioration that's continuing. But she is in an environment that supports that. She's not being medicated so that she could be left in a room sleeping all day and night. She is interacting. She has a home, a place to live in that feels like a home. And when I visit her, I feel like I'm at her house and we can sit at the food bar or just go into the kitchen area and we can have a conversation as we would have in her home when she was still independently living.
That's wonderful to hear. Your analogy to a smaller classroom is really spot on, Jessica. It's something I'm gonna take and keep with me. You're absolutely right. And, we're proud to have developed this platform. I think it's a better platform and it does have a meaningful difference. But I like what you said about the smaller classroom. I think that's apt. I would say 80% of our transitional residents, when they come from another facility, 80% of them have been what we consider to be over-medicated. And we find that to be absolutely atrocious.
Yes.
If these larger communities are going to get by and make up for staffing shortfalls and competent operational consistency by over-medicating their residents, it is atrocious. And I'll just remind your listeners, find out who owns the place, when it was last sold to whom. Don't fall for the slick marketing pitch.
Right.
that will bombard you with these fancy, it sounds great. I admit it sounds great.
Right.
I admit, because I've also sold that before I kind of realized there wasn't really where the rubber met the road, came up short, and I didn't like that feeling.
Right.
So you want to understand the ownership structure. You don't want to fall for the marketing. You do want active, committed, long-term owners behind the community. And you always want to find and interview the longest serving staff member there and find out if they have the authority and flexibility to make decisions on the spot.
Yes.
I think those four things will tell anybody a lot about a community, whether it's assisted living or memory care. Assisted living in some ways is no different. It's just a slightly longer game, a slightly different game. And that game is subject to whether the buyer prefers to be in that over-featured high cost bracket or not. I think as we go forward, there is a coming disaster in terms of memory care, affordability, and the sheer numbers behind the demographic boom. I think you will continue to see, therefore, financially driven investors into the space. And I think they're going to build to formula what everybody else has built. And that formula is geared towards the institutional buyer, not the residential family.
Right.
And I find that divergence, I'd rather side with families, real people, real issues, real problems. And that to me gives me a real meaningful sense of satisfaction. And that's important to me. So that's what I would encourage your listeners. You know, I think you have become a tremendous source and expert on kind of the pitfalls and the marketing and how to approach the sector. I would encourage all your listeners to reach out to you. You're informed, you're knowledgeable, and I think most importantly, you have the right compass heading and can help a lot of people. And I think that's important and speaks well of how you've entered this topic, how you've discovered what's behind it, and your willingness to do so. I think it's fabulous.
Thank you for saying that. It has been a lot of trial and error on my part and trying to become that smarter, better educated consumer and not fall for the pitfalls of what marketing is trying to encourage, but finding the resources and the places that meet mom's needs, that fulfill that demand.
The last thing I'll say, and I just had it, is I'll have to tack back to it. I'll probably remember as soon as we finish, but it was a good point, and it just vanished. I'm sorry to say.
It's called a senior moment in mom's world.
Yeah. I guess you do this enough, it starts to affect you.
Yeah, it does. And that's going through this information. It's these little light bulbs that flicker every now and again when I have an experience and I realize, oh, I could have or I should have. And having more and more of those moments where if I thought use the mindset of what mom needed versus what I wanted, those light bulbs were there. And I think you just got it.
The last point, and now I remember now, memory care can be a slow process as you bump up against where and when you need memory care, when you need to move a parent into a community. It doesn't sneak up overnight and all of a sudden become something unmanageable. Right. I would encourage, therefore, your listeners to invest the time to learn a little bit about their communities. I understand that they may have a tough situation at home, but I'm just going to say that tough situation isn't going to get any less or more tough by virtue of taking a week. And the reason why I say that is I consider a well-educated consumer to be our kind of resident, our kind of family. 90% of communities out there do not want a well-educated consumer. Exactly. And that is the difference. And I can't say that strongly enough. They will take advantage of your need. They will sell you the moon. They won't even be there a year from now, and you're not going to get the moon. That's the long and short of this story. And I feel bad because a lot of people fall into that. And I think it's unfortunate.
It is, unfortunately. And I'm glad you were ending on that point, because that brings one of my last thoughts to mind. The timing of when you're doing this. A lot of us avoid that conversation because it's difficult for us to have that conversation with our parents, depending on where their level of understanding or their cognitive abilities or where they are in their stages of dementia. It's hard to have that conversation, but I know one of the mistakes I made as far as timing goes was I kept telling myself I wanted one more Christmas, one more Thanksgiving, one more birthday, one more something that would delay having to go through the process. When I started to do the homework and started to do the research before we actually needed it, it made a lot more sense to me. I had the time to make the decisions, and I had the time to learn and ask more questions. And then along the way, I started to learn what questions I needed to ask.
That's right.
Versus being in that emergency, mom fell and broke her hip. Mom fell or dad fell and bumped his head. And so now we have to, whether it's the temporary physical therapy kind of time or, okay, because of this fall, we now know we have to have this. And now you're stressed. And these communities pick up on that stress. And if you've ever experienced any kind of other event where you step into either a funeral home or a wedding parlor to plan your wedding, they pick up on what your needs are and they see dollar signs. They know how to sell to you. So when you do it on your time limit, it's so much better than if you're in emergency.
You know, you really hit the nail on the head. It's a difficult conversation for a lot of different reasons. But one of the reasons that's transactional is guilt.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. Communities will pick up on that. We have a very simple approach in my communities, which is that we meet people and we let them make that decision. We view ourselves as sources of information. Mm-hmm. If you have a question, you can call us, you know where we are, and that's our sales pitch. A lot of these other places will call you. They have a call list. They have a marketing director reporting to a vice president who wants to know how many times you touched these leads. We will call once and to check up on you and to make sure you're managing okay and if we can be any help. And then we leave people with call us for any reason. We call us if you want to go to another community. We'll give you our input. We're here as a resource, and I think that really cuts through a lot of the chatter. Yes. A lot of people we get tell us that they should have listened to us the first time around, and that everything that we told them was spot on, and that they felt much better knowing that we were in the neighborhood. So I encourage your listeners, take some time, do what you did. As I said, what you did was phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And it's the way to get to the bottom of what's going to be the right environment for your parent, your loved one. Yes. And look at who owns it. Don't fall for the traps. Talk to the staff. Find the longest serving person. Get a sense of what it's really like. And if that's the place for you, having gone through that, then you made a solid decision. And if it doesn't work out, that's just part of, things don't work out for a lot of different reasons, but there are other options.
Definitely. So the other options, I do want to take a quick moment for you to be able to let us know future plans, if you're willing to let us know about the Nest.
The Nest concept is it's an exciting platform for us that's garnered a lot of attention. It's nothing new per se. We're converting homes for use as a memory care community. What makes it different is that we're actually using a custom home, premium level home as the model. And the reason we're doing that is people are paying for memory care. They're paying a little bit more than senior care in general. And we feel that we can offer them that premium environment for the money without costing them additional money. It's a lower income producing platform for us. I'll tell you where the idea came from. I am currently, like many people, are struggling with my mom, who lives in North Carolina, and she probably could use assisted living, but does not want to. She doesn't want to live in a big place. I have thought about building a home and marketing that as an assisted living for a small group of people. And that naturally made me think, well, I think this would really be good in a memory care setting. And I'll tell you why. In going to a home, a pure home, leaving aside for now that it's a premium level home, the transition risk in going from a home into a home is virtually negligible. And by that, the awareness, the rhythm of life, the visuals that they are used to seeing when they walk around their home are exactly the same that you will see in this model, because it is a home. It is a nice home. It is a home that will generate a lot of curb appeal. And if you want to be wowed by a facility, forget the stone dining room. How about walking into a nice premium home that you could also live in or aspire to living in? You know that your parents are going to be in a premium environment that does not need to contrive a likeness to home because it is a home. So that's the Nest platform. We're very excited about it because we can bring kind of a high level of finish and flow and natural transition in the memory care space, and we can do it from a premium level home. The idea of going to a premium level home wasn't driven by a need to offer a gussied up community, right. But our thought was, people are paying more for memory care. Let's try to give them as much as we can for the money. And by that, I simply mean there's a base cost that covers your labor and build costs, which have gotten more expensive, unfortunately.
Yes.
But if you can give them a wow factor residence that's not just a facade on top of a warehouse, you can really provide a nice experience for a even smaller group of people and reduce that transition risk down to nothing. That's the driving goal behind it. We're just tacking on some bells and whistles, in this case, not to generate a higher price point, but to give people a nicer environment that's not contrived. So we're thinking about that, and that's one of the directions we're moving in. And I think that could be a game changer because it really does meet it more than competes on a facility level, and it more than competes on a care level, and it more than competes on a value level. So that's kind of the things that are interesting to me and my group, is really providing value for families and residents. And this is how we can do it. And so we're very excited.
I'm just as excited because it's relief to know that not everything out there is going to be the worst case scenario or the sad story
That's
you
right.
see on the news, that there are better options out there for our loved ones.
That's right. Absolutely. And I encourage your listeners to listen to you and to call you and to do their homework and remember those things that I mentioned. They'll be in a lot better position when the time comes.
Yes. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to share this information, valuable information with us to help us become better, smarter consumers.
I really appreciate the opportunity, Jessica. I think what you're doing is fantastic. I really mean that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So thank you for joining in with us today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this gave you a lot more food for thought when it comes to your memory care choices or assisted living in general. Until next time, be proactive. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. We really hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about proactive caregiving and to hear other episodes of this podcast, please visit www.jessicalazelcannon.com. This podcast is produced by Cannon Light Media, LLC, www.cannonlightmedia.com. Music provided by Chris Paradise.
Mary redeemed a $50,000 cash prize playing Chumba Casino this year.
I was only playing for fun, so winning this was a dream come true.
Chumba Casino is America's #1 social casino experience. It's serious fun. With over 80 casino-style games to choose from, you too could win life-changing amounts of cash. Be like Mary. Log on to ChumbaCasino.com and give them a whirl. That's ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void or prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
The voice in the preceding commercial was not the actual voice of a winner.